Hello, friends. This is Ranger Mike at Huntington Beach State Park. Today, join me as we take a tour of Atalaya, our National Historic Landmark. Now, probably the first question on your mind is, what is an Atalaya? Well, an Atalaya is actually Spanish for watchtower and refers to the very literal centerpiece of the entire building. So Archer Huntington, who built Atalaya as a winter home for both himself and his wife, Anna Hyatt Huntington, as a young man, he traveled extensively along the coast of Spain. And there he was very impressed with Moorish fortresses he had seen built along the coast back in the Middle Ages. And he decided to use that inspiration for Atalaya. Now, all of those fortresses would have had an Atalaya or watchtower. And be honest, those ones in Europe, those watchtowers are used to keep a lookout for enemy forces or pirates. But you know what? Neither was very much an issue in 1930 South Carolina. So this watchtower was actually designed to serve a more practical purpose. Originally, there was a large water tank at the top. They would pump water into that tank, and it was a water tower providing water pressure for the entire building. But Archer also had another purpose in mind for his watchtower. He wanted it to provide a home for bats. The Huntingtons, having never lived in the South before, were very concerned about mosquitoes. And Archer had a rather forward thinking idea. He was going to build a watchtower that was really a water tower that was also going to double as a giant bat house. He wanted bats to live in it. One of those bats go flying out every evening to eat the mosquitoes. Turns out, though, the Huntingtons came across a more practical way of avoiding mosquitoes, and that is they only visited in the wintertime. Our next stop is a room that most of our visitors don't even realize is a room, and that would be the outdoor studio. So Anna, being a world famous sculptor, she did have certain requirements she needed to fulfill to achieve her art. One of those was she preferred to work with live models whenever possible, especially when she was sculpting animals. But the other thing is she very much preferred to work under natural sunlight. So the outdoor studio without a roof was perfect for that. However, not every day was a beautiful day, and today is a great example of that. So on a rainy day like today, working in the outdoor studio wouldn't have worked nearly as well as the indoor studio, and that will be our next stop. Our next stop is the indoor studio. So the indoor studio was kind of like the backup plan when the weather wasn't cooperating like today. So the indoor studio had a massive skylight that ran from one end of the room to the other to admit as much natural sunlight as possible, as well as large windows on either side. Another feature of the indoor studio was this large fireplace. So keep in mind, Atalaya was used primarily as a wintertime residence. And in fact, one of the things that brought the Huntingtons to South Carolina originally was Anna had been diagnosed with a disease, tuberculosis. And the doctors told her that if there was any hope for her recovering, they had to find a warmer climate to spend the winter in. That took the Huntingtons on a journey down the newly constructed Intracoastal Waterway. And while passing through this area, what we nowadays call the Waccamaw Neck region of Georgetown County, they saw an advertisement offering for sale a hunting club that had been built on the remnants of 4 former rice plantations. They purchased that land outright and used that to build their winter home, Atalaya, and also construct a setting for Anna's many sculptures, Brook Green Gardens, right across the street, what became one of South Carolina's very first tourist attractions. Another interesting aspect of the indoor studio is the Huntingtons married rather late in life. So they didn't have any children, but they had a lot of love to give, and they both loved animals. So they had a whole menagerie of pets that traveled with them. 20 plus dogs, swans, peacocks, a macaw parrot, and a group of monkeys. And whenever the Huntingtons were staying here at Atalaya, the monkeys lived in the indoor studio. The monkeys, besides being pets, were also the subjects of several of Anna's sculptures. So this room here was originally the office for Archer Huntington's secretary, Miss Perkins. Now, there has been an alteration in the building that was done back in the late 50s, well after the Huntingtons had left Atalaya for the last time. So originally, when Archer Huntington was here, there was just a little hole in the wall for passing notes and papers and correspondence back and forth. But since it is a doorway now, let's go ahead and use it. This room right here is Archer Huntington's study. So here, Archer would have worked on the coordination of the many different museums that he was building or running. Building museums was actually Archer Huntington's hobby. Over the course of his life, he built museums, including Brookgreen Gardens, devoted to American figurative sculpture. He built the Mariners Museum in Newport News, Virginia, the American Hispanic Society Museum in New York City, as well as museums devoted to coin collecting, map collecting, and even golf, believe it or not. So all of those took a lot of work. Of course, he worked on the ideas and the construction of Brookgreen Gardens. But another thing that Archer probably worked on here was his art form. So you see, while his wife, Anna Hyatt, was world famous for her sculpting, Archer was much less famous for his particular art form, and that was poetry. Archer loved poetry, loved writing poems. He published several volumes of poetry over the course of his life, and he also established the National Poet Laureate program with the Library of Congress. So a fund that he set up many decades ago still supports poets and the creation of their art in the United States even to this day. Our next stop is Archer Huntington's bathroom. So one of the unique features about this particular part of the building is notice this shower stall. So Archer was a very large man. He was 6'5" tall, and his shower originally had 7 shower heads. So you can kind of see where they needed their own water tower. Next, we're going to continue on to the Huntington's master bedroom. Follow me. So this was the master bedroom. This is where the Huntington slept. Now, a few things to note. First off, the view outside these windows, even if it wasn't raining like it is today, would have been far different. When Atalaya was built, it was actually built in the sand dunes right on the beach. So the waves would have been crashing right outside the window. Shorebirds have been running up and down the beach. So what happened? Well, Atalaya didn't move, the beach did. In 1979, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers began constructing the Murrells Inlet jetties to actually hold the mouth of Murrells Inlet in one spot. And in doing so, those massive jetties dramatically changed the current to move sand around and caused the beach here in front of Atalaya to grow much wider. So the beach has been heading that way for a few decades. So one of my favorite stories to tell of the many tours I've done of Atalaya is several years ago, I had a visitor who the day before visiting us here at Atalaya had done a tour of the Biltmore Estates in North Carolina. And in this very room, they made what I thought was a very profound comment. And their comment was, Atalaya is kind of like the anti-Biltmore. And I think that kind of sums things up pretty well. So Atalaya was not built to impress the neighbors. Atalaya was built as a place of refuge and escape for the Huntingtons. I think Atalaya is as noteworthy for what it does not have as for what it does. So what are some of the features that Atalaya does not have? There's no ballroom. There's no billiard room. How many guest bedrooms do you think are in Atalaya? 0, not a single one. And I'm sure that wasn't an accident. That was very much by design. When the Huntingtons were here at Atalaya, they were both artists. They both wanted to be inspired by nature. They both wanted to work on their respective art forms. They did not want to feel obligated to live up to entertaining a lot of guests and visitors. Our next stop will be Anna's bathroom. So this is Anna's bathroom, and it is another room of the building that has seen some pretty dramatic alterations dating back to the late 1950s when the Huntingtons had a caretaker living here. So the caretakers, they had a couple of small toddler children. They felt the home was too big, so they only lived kind of in this corner wing of the building. And therefore, they actually converted Anna's bathroom into a kitchen. That's why we have a 1950s era kitchen sink in Anna's bathroom. Let's head on down the hall, and our next stop will be the secretary's bedroom. So this is Miss Perkins' bedroom and bathroom. She was the private secretary of Archer Huntington and Anna Huntington as well. And she's one of the very few staff who lived in Atalaya who had their very own private bathroom. Let's continue on to the library. So this is the library. So the library, of course, housed books, not just for the Huntingtons, but these books that were also available to the staff that worked for them. But for me, I think one of the most remarkable things about the library is it shows the damage from hurricanes. So Atalaya, keep in mind, was originally much closer to the ocean than it is nowadays. And it has weathered two terrible hurricanes. Hurricane Hazel back in the 1950s and Hurricane Hugo back in 1989. And during both of those storms, the storm surge would have been almost chest deep here in Atalaya. So you can see that the floor has shifted as the foundation got underwashed. There are big cracks in the walls. And even one doorway collapsed and has had to have been walled up. Atalaya was actually built over a 3-year period between 1931 to 1933, using a crew of 100 local men. So the Huntingtons were adamant about employing only people that lived in the local community. And the truth of it was they could have finished Atalaya much quicker than 3 years, but the Huntingtons were deliberately trying to stretch out the construction period of Atalaya because they were trying to employ as many people in the local community as they possibly could during a very rough time in our nation's history, during the Great Depression. And in fact, if the Huntingtons couldn't find local people who had the trade skills needed to build a certain aspect of Atalaya, they would generally bring in skilled craftsmen to teach locals the skills, not just for working on Atalaya, but skills they could go use in the future to find employment. Now, there are really just two notable exceptions where the Huntingtons did bring in outside help, and you can see both of those here in the library. So one, if you look up at the ceiling, you will notice, if you look carefully under the paint, you will see wood grain. The ceiling is actually made of cast concrete. And in this particular case, Archer Huntington brought in a crew from his Newport News shipyards. They actually put in steel I-beams that are encased in concrete, and they made molds out of wood to pour the concrete in, and that's what is responsible for the wood grain that you're seeing. Let's continue on to our next stop, Party Central, the foyer, where the Huntingtons did most of their entertaining here at Atalaya. Follow me. So this is the foyer. This is where the Huntingtons did most of their entertaining of guests. And you will notice it's a very small room. The Huntington's idea of entertaining was generally to have just a couple of people over for tea for maybe an hour and send them on the way so they could get back to working on their art. So some of the notable features of the foyer include the plaque designating Atalaya as a National Historic Landmark. Atalaya is one of only 2 National Historic Landmarks that are found in the South Carolina State Park Service. So you've been hearing me talk about Anna Hyatt Huntington for quite a bit. So this is a photo of her right here. So Anna grew up in a home that very much valued science and the arts. Her mother was an artist. She worked in watercolors. Her older sister was a sculptor. Her father was a scientist who studied zoology and paleontology, in particular ice age mammals. Anna also grew up on a farm, so she was very connected to nature and wildlife. Also, notice what day of the year was Anna born. And of course, I've been talking about Archer Huntington quite a bit as well. So here is a painting of what Archer would have looked like. So Archer was the son of Collis P. Huntington. And Collis actually made the Huntington's original family fortune, first on the California gold rush, not on finding gold, but selling to supplies to people hoping to find gold. Collis took that original Huntington family fortune, then and invested it in the Transcontinental Railroad, the first railroad uniting the East and West Coast together. Still not content with that vast fortune, multiplied it even further by building the Newport News shipyards. And Archer, being the only son, inherited this vast fortune from his father. Also, notice what Archer's birthday was. Did you notice that Anna's birthday was March 10th and Archer's birthday was March 10th? Now, can you guess what day of the year were they wed? That's right, March 10th, what the Huntingtons themselves refer to as their 3 in 1 day. And every March 10th, our wonderful volunteers at Huntington Beach State Park, the Friends of Huntington Beach State Park, throw a big celebration to honor all the things that the Huntingtons have left for us. Next stop, the dining room. Follow me. These 2 rooms of Atalaya were devoted to meals. Now we just passed through the breakfast room down here. The breakfast room originally had a door going to a patio that would have looked out over the beach. So that's where the Huntingtons would have had their morning breakfast, their morning coffee. This room right here was the dining room. So we do know that the furnishings in here would have been a wrought iron table with a glass top. The features of that wrought iron table were designed by Anna Huntington and made by the same company who did the grill work on the windows. So the motifs and the colors would have carried through. Now, one interesting feature of the dining room, if you look very carefully up here, you can see a wooden strip with nails. And we do know from Anna's journal that what originally hung there. We know that there was a tapestry that hung from there that depicted hunting scenes. And we do know from Anna's journal what became of it. So when the Huntingtons were wrapping up their last visit to Atalaya, during World War II, they had turned Atalaya over to the U.S. Army Air Corps, and they only came back for 3 very brief visits following the end of World War II. And then, realizing that they were not returning, Anna began giving away all of the furnishings. And in the case of the tapestries that hung in the dining room, we know that she packed those up and sent those to California to their West Coast Huntington cousins. And wouldn't it have been great to be a fly on the wall out in California when the cousins, who were just as wealthy as Archer and Anna were, when they unpacked those tapestries, which after hanging for many years in Atalaya in the damp climate, must certainly have been moldy and moth-eaten. Sadly, history does not record that particular moment. So once again, Atalaya was intended to be a wintertime residence. There are fireplaces in pretty much every living space. But even then, the Huntingtons found that they still weren't able to keep the building quite as warm as they'd liked. So they went back and in several places added these. So wherever you see one of these openings high up in the wall, that is where they went and added a coal burning stove to provide additional heat for the building. Right over here, we have the sideboard. This is where the Huntingtons' meals would have been prepared in the kitchen here, and then the food passed through to be served to the Huntingtons in their dining room or to be served to the staff members in their living space. So let's go check that out. We are now in the staff living room. So we do know that this room was furnished totally different than any other room in all of Atalaya. Elsewhere in Atalaya, all the furnishings are rather austere. Wrought iron, glass tops, marble, mirrored sconces to hang on the wall. But the staff living room is totally different. This was had nice rugs on the floor, big overstuffed couches for the staff to relax. Now, back then, there was not telephone service available to the outside world, but Atalaya had its own internal telephone system. And you can actually see a little bit of where it once was in the imprints on the wall. And basically, the Huntingtons had had the ability to ring from any room in the house to alert staff when they needed assistance with something. We're now in the kitchen, which is where all those meals came from. So we do know the Huntingtons generally did not set a menu. They relied on their staff to make the best meal from the freshest local ingredients. We do know that the Huntingtons preferred simple country cooking, going back to Anna's childhood growing up on a farm. We know that both the Huntingtons very much loved seafood, so they certainly picked an ideal spot to build Atalaya. Being so close to Murrells Inlet and the vast salt marshes, the Huntingtons actually had an employee whose whole job was to go fishing, crabbing, clamming, oystering, shrimping every day to find some kind of seafood to put on the dinner table that evening. Now, the one thing we know, and we're very fortunate because Anna did keep a very detailed journal her entire adult life, we do know that she did not like fancy French cuisine, which was all the rage with their social set. And Anna's problem with that is when Anna sat down for a meal, she wanted to look at her dinner plate and know exactly what she was about to eat. If it was too fancy or covered in thick sauces and she had to play a guessing game, that was a big turnoff to her. And while we're on the subject of meals, right back here we have the kitchen pantry as well as the ice box. And we can walk back here and take a look. So while Atalaya was built for electricity, in fact, the Huntingtons literally brought electricity to this area of South Carolina, paying thousands of dollars to have electrical wires run all the way from the city of Georgetown. That power did go out a lot. So they had backup plans, they had a backup generator, and in the case of keeping the food cold, they had an ice box. This whole room here was refrigerated by large blocks of ice that were brought in on a regular basis from the city of Georgetown. There was a door here which opened to the outside. There was a large winch and pulley system just outside that they could winch those big blocks of ice into the ice box. Next, we're going to be exploring the staff quarters. Follow me. So here in the staff wings, we have linen storage and restrooms on this side of the corridor. And on this side were the maids' rooms. So the Huntingtons had a number of maids, most of which were from Scotland, because that was the thing people of their wealthy class generally did. They also had a butler, a female butler. Next, let's take a closer look at one of the maids' quarters. So each of the maids would have had their own private bedroom. They would have had a bed and a writing desk, a wardrobe for storing their clothes. However, they all shared restrooms and a shower and bath facility just down the hall. So this room right here, this was the head housekeeper's room, Mrs. McKinnon. And she was in charge of managing the staff of maids. She would generally travel to Atalaya a few weeks ahead of the Huntingtons to get the house opened up and prepared for the Huntingtons' visit, and then would stay behind a little bit to get everything closed back up, linens cleaned and put back into storage, things like that. So one of the hallmarks of Miss McKinnon's high status in the Huntington household was she was one of the few staff who had her own private bath. She also had great views of the courtyard as well. Next, we're going to visit where the washing was done. So this area right here was the laundry room. So this is where all the clothes and linens were washed, not just for the Huntingtons, but for all the staff who lived on site. We also know that it was a laundry man who did the laundry. So there would have been areas to wash the clothes, wringers to wring out the excess water after they had been washed. And then there was a whole mini courtyard full of clotheslines so the clothes could be dried in the pure country air, but also out of sight of the main courtyard. So this is the laundry drying yard, kind of a little miniature courtyard. There would have been pulleys and lines so they could string the clothes out here to dry out in the country air. Also, where we now have public restrooms for Atalaya, those were originally small quarters, two small apartments that housed the two male staff members, the chauffeur and the laundryman. Alrighty, folks, follow me. We're going to head out to the courtyard next. So I did want to make just a brief comment about the landscaping of the courtyard here in Atalaya. This is not the original landscape. The original landscape for Atalaya lasted less than a year. So the original landscaping was very small palmettos, giant Spanish bayonet yuccas, and huge prickly pear cactuses. And with all of the pets and dogs and geese and peacocks running around, flying around all throughout the courtyard, I'm sure the Huntingtons pretty quickly realized they had planted a yard full of eye poker outers. So they ripped that landscape out and they put in what you see now, probably around 1934. So we have lots of our native cabbage palmettos, which are a state tree here in South Carolina, interspersed with some smaller phoenix palms, dwarf palmettos, and needle palms in the beds in the back. And then, of course, lots of creeping fig vines covering the interior walls of Atalaya. Speaking of the interior walls of Atalaya, let's take a closer look at some of the brickwork. That has an interesting story to tell as well. So one of the most distinctive features of Atalaya is the rather unusual brickwork favored by Archer Huntington. So Archer loved this particular type of masonry, what is called slump joint mortar, or what has become known locally as the Huntington squeeze. And this is actually very difficult to do because you can't put a level on it like you could a normal brick wall. So Archer wanted this for two different reasons. One, he wanted the creeping fig vines to grow on the interior walls, so those vines had to have something to attach to. But for the exterior walls, he wanted that fortress wall look. So they had to go back and stucco over that brick. And once again, they needed something for the stucco to stick to. Another distinctive feature of some of the brickwork is this lattice brickwork with the openings in between the bricks. That gives you privacy, but also allows cooling breezes to come through as well. Next, let's head over to the stables. The stables are where the Huntingtons would have housed their pet horses, which would have been Polly and Bob. Now, Polly and Bob would have lived at the stables across the street at Brookring Gardens, except when the Huntingtons were actually staying here at Atalaya. But perhaps the most famous resident of all in the stables was Old Stevie. Old Stevie is immortalized in one of Anna Huntington's most famous sculptures, her sculpture of Don Quixote. And Don Quixote's horse was named Rocinante. And for Anna's depiction of Don Quixote, she wanted to depict him near the end of his life, worn, weathered, beaten down. And she wanted the same for Rocinante. So to find her model for Rocinante, Anna and her sister got in the car. They drove all over Georgetown County, touring farms, looking for the saddest, most decrepit, pathetic horse they could possibly find. And they found a winner. They found Old Stevie. So Anna paid $25 for Old Stevie, and then also paid the farmer to actually walk Old Stevie to Atalaya, which actually took a few days. By the time Old Stevie got to Atalaya, he was so weak he could barely stand on his own four hooves. So Anna had her workmen actually rig up a sling from the rafters inside of the stables. And that sling went under old Stevie's belly to keep him on his feet. And Anna began her sculpting. Old Stevie turned out to be a remarkable model. And of course, Anna took very good care of old Stevie, and he went on to a very happy and long retirement. So another feature of Atalaya I get asked lots of questions about are the bear pens. Did the Huntingtons keep pet bears? No, they did not. Anna did keep live models for anything that she was sculpting if a living example existed. So if she was sculpting a bear, she would have a live bear brought over, and the bear would temporarily live for a couple of days here in the bear pens while Anna worked on her sculpture. Anna was known as an animaleer. She very much preferred sculpting animals over people. In a few cases, she did sculpt people, but she almost always put them on horseback. Perhaps a notable example of this, if you've ever been to Andrew Jackson State Park, Anna rather famously, at the urging of school children from Lancaster County, agreed to sculpt a young Andrew Jackson to be featured as a prominent part of Andrew Jackson State Park. But of course, she had to put him on horseback. That sculpture, by the way, is still a prominent feature of the park. So if you're ever in Lancaster County, make sure to stop by Andrew Jackson State Park and check it out. Another feature of Atalaya were the dog kennels. And what you see here is just a tiny little bit of them. When the Huntingtons were staying here at Atalaya, the dog kennels would have run the entire south side of the building, and they actually had their own house to house the kennel staff. So the Huntingtons had actually purchased a mail order house that was originally erected on the river across the street on the Brookgreen property. And then later on, the Huntingtons took that apart and placed it on the south side of the building for all of the animal care staff to live in. So the Huntingtons dearly loved their dogs. They had 20 plus dogs that traveled with them around their various estates around the country. Anna was especially fond of the Scottish Deerhound. And so much so that she actually became America's foremost breeder of the Scottish Deerhound. Some of the lineage of those original dogs is still around today. And in fact, Angus is the Scottish Deerhound mascot of Brookgreen Gardens. So the next time you're visiting Brookgreen Gardens, see if you can say hello to Angus. Remember how earlier I was saying that the Huntingtons had an employee whose whole job it was to go fishing, crabbing, clamming? Well, believe it or not, they had a whole room at Atalaya devoted to just that. This is the oyster shucking room. And here that employee would take the catch of whatever he had, and this is where he would clean the fish or shuck the oysters or open the clams, head the shrimp, what have you. Some of the other features back here included some of the things that were required for the day-to-day maintenance of Atalaya. This big brick box back here originally held a tank, a diesel tank, that would have fueled the backup generator that we mentioned earlier. And then there was the wood shed where they would have stored the wood for the fireplaces. And then the little room with the chimney, that was the incinerator. So that was a common feature of big estates decades ago when there was no trash service. You had to get rid of your own trash. And so many buildings would have had a dedicated incinerator for that. I have one more stop I'd like to show you before we wrap things up. Our last stop is the garage of Atalaya. And just to let you in on a little bit of my own personal history, I actually lived in the Huntington's garage when I first worked at Huntington Beach State Park, fresh out of college back in 1991. And in fact, to the best of my knowledge, I believe I'm the last person to have lived in Atalaya in the Huntington's garage. Every bit as glamorous as it sounds. Nowadays, the garage is put to maybe better use as a small visitor center to educate our visitors about the history of the Huntingtons and of Atalaya. We hope you've enjoyed your virtual visit with us today to Atalaya, our National Historic Landmark here at Huntington Beach State Park. This is Ranger Mike signing off, and I look forward to seeing you out at the park someday soon. Thanks again for your time today.